So Dawn of War 4 recently had a battle report published, and the more I watch of it, the more I realise just how much information was hiding in plain sight. Now, in the first video of the series we are looking at now, we broke down some core multiplayer mechanics, covering things like the economy, research, veterancy, reserves, and stratagems. Then in part 2, we looked at the Blood Ravens and how their units, wargear, and precision-focused playstyle comes together on the battlefield. But today's video, the part 3 of the series, we'll be switching our attention to the Orks. And from everything we've seen so far, it feels like this faction is built around one core idea, and that is momentum. Instead of sitting back to secure his own base first, Elliot Verbeest, one of the players today, immediately pushed out towards the center of the map to contest one of the power nodes, explaining that starving the Space Marine player of power is just as valuable as collecting resources for himself. It's a small moment, but it does tell us a lot about how the faction is expected to operate. Because rather than reacting to what the opponent is doing, it looks like the Orks are encouraged to dictate the pace of the match from the very beginning, forcing fights over important objectives before enemies have time to build the economy that they really want. Anyway, that aggressive mindset also carries over into one of the biggest mechanical differences that we've seen so far between the Orks and the other factions in Dawn of War 4. During the commentary, Elliot explains that almost every Ork infantry can actually construct buildings almost anywhere on the map, allowing the faction to gradually spread production structures and defensive positions, by the way, across the map instead of being tied to a single headquarters. He even described it as base crawling, and I think that actually goes a perfect way to describe what we're looking at. Because unlike the Blood Ravens, who seemingly rely on carefully placed forward deployments and reserve drops, the Orks can literally expand their base as they conquer new territory. Every successful push allows them to establish another foothold, making it progressively harder for their opponents to reclaim ground once the green tide starts rolling. Now, the headquarters itself is something we only get a brief glimpse of, but the tooltip does reveal that it's called the Mega Boss Bunker. It can produce your basic infantry and commander, and also it comes equipped with mounted weapons for self-defense, which is pretty important, to be honest, because the main objective in multiplayer matches is to destroy your enemy headquarters, and so the mounted weapons should make that even harder for the enemies of the green tide. Anyway, looking at the production icons, we can also see that they can train the commanders, and in this case, Guzkata. They can also clearly produce Gretchins, Slugga Boyz, and Shoota Boyz, making it the foundations of the Ork early game before players start branching out into more specialized production structures. And one of those structures looks like it will be the Boyz Fort. According to the tooltips, the Boyz Fort functions as an infantry production building whilst also providing research options and defending itself with a mounted big shooter. More interestingly though, is the range of units that it can produce. From this single structure, the Orks can make the Slugga Boyz, the Shoota Boyz, and even Meganobz. Now, to be honest, amongst those units, the Meganobz immediately stand out because they are described as elite infantry that are effective at range, they perform well against most targets, and they possess high durability. Essentially, it looks like they will be the heavy backbone of an Ork infantry force before the truly massive walkers begin arriving later on in the match. Instead of specializing in one particular target type, it looks like these guys will be reliable all-rounders that can hold the line while the rest of the army floods around them. Of course, it probably will take a bit of time to get out the Meganobz, and so no Ork army would be complete without the boys. Now, the Slugga Boyz are classified as melee infantry that excel in close combat, where their highest damage is directed towards light infantry. It looks like they will remain reasonably effective though against heavy infantry, but their effectiveness does sharply drop against vehicles and structures, making it clear that these guys are dedicated anti-infantry brawlers rather than your general purpose assault units. The Shoota Boyz though, as you'd expect, occupy almost the opposite role. Acting as light infantry, they specialize in ranged combat whilst also having low durability. But what really caught my attention wasn't really their battlefield role, but actually one line hidden in the tooltip that has huge implications for the late game. Both the Slugga Boyz and the Shoota Boyz actually can become free to produce once maximum Waaagh has been reached. That is an incredibly orky mechanic because it means that the faction doesn't just simply unlock stronger units as the game progresses, it actually becomes easier and easier to replace casualties, allowing players to flood the battlefield with endless waves of infantry just as the Waaagh reaches its peak. It sounds kinda crazy, I don't know if it's going to be broken, but it's certainly going to be exciting to watch. Anyway, we also get the first look at Orc Infantry wargear through the Shoota Boyz. One available upgrade equips a squad member with a big shooter, increasing ranged damage against every category of target, including infantry, vehicles and structures. And so rather than transforming the unit into a specialist role, well, it simply improves its effectiveness across the board, suggesting that even your basic infantry can actually continue scaling into the late game instead of becoming obsolete once heavier units begin appearing. Now the next branch of the roster though comes from the Beast Snagga Hut, and to be honest, it seems like this is where the Orks start to diversify. Like many of the faction's buildings, it does combine production with research, whilst also defending itself with a big mounted shooter. Instead of producing the standard boys though, it focuses on the Beast Snagga units, including Beast Snagga Boyz and Squighog Boyz, both of which appear to fill pretty different battlefield roles from each other, where the Beast Snagga Boyz are described as battle line infantry that are effective in melee, good against infantry, and moderately durable. They do look like they're going to be tougher frontline troops than the standard Slugga Boyz. The Squighog Boyz though look particularly interesting because they are classified as mounted infantry with high mobility and the ability to throw explosives. Immediately, it does feel like they will be pretty different from the rest of the Orc roster. Rather than simply charging straight into combat, the Squighog Boyz seem designed to harass enemy positions, rapidly capture objectives maybe, and even soften targets with explosives before closing in into melee. In fact, we even get a glimpse of one of their wargear options called Sticker Throw, which allows them to hurl explosives that deal area damage, and later another upgrade called Mobbing Up, which actually increases the squad size by adding 2 extra members. And that's actually a wonderfully orky mechanic, because instead of simply improving their statistics, well, veteran squads literally become larger as the battle progresses. Speaking of which, as the match does progress, simply producing more boys isn't really the end goal for the Orcs either. Their early units are certainly there to help them secure territory and establish a presence across the map, but once that foundation has been built, it looks like the faction begins transitioning into something much more dangerous through its research system and specialized production buildings. As it happens, one detail that Jan briefly does mention during the battle report is that research in Dawn of War 4 does not cost resources. Instead, it only costs time. Now of course that is going to completely change the way that you're expected to think about upgrades, because rather than asking yourself whether you can actually afford an upgrade, it's more about what order you want to get them in. Now what's really interesting about the Orcs is that instead of having technologies that improve individual units, many of their upgrades seem to actually reinforce the faction's overall identity by making their whole armies larger, tougher, and easier to sustain over the course of a long match. The Beast Snagga Hut is probably the best example of this philosophy, because alongside producing Beast Snagga Boyz and the Squighog Boyz, it also contains research upgrades that point towards building a stronger front line rather than unlocking flashy new mechanics. One of those upgrades is Ardor Armor, which increases the armor of all Orc infantry. It sounds simple, but when you're fielding large numbers of relatively inexpensive units, even a modest increase in durability can translate into dozens of additional models surviving every engagement. Another upgrade, Beast Snagga Teeth, which reduces the production cost of every Beast Snagga unit by 25%, again fits perfectly with the way the faction is designed. Rather than encouraging players to carefully preserve a handful of elite units, the game rewards you for actually producing even more units and keeping the pressure on your opponent. If you've already secured map control, upgrades like this should actually allow you to capitalize and really push that advantage even further, because you're reinforcing your army more efficiently when continuing to expand. What we must not forget about though is the Orky Outriders, which does increase the capture speed of Squighog Boyz by an incredible 150%. That is of course a specific upgrade to a specific unit, and it does suggest that King Art Games want these mounted units to play a much bigger strategic role than simply charging into combat. With movement speed already on their side, turning them into a fast objective capturing unit makes them pretty different from the rest of the faction's units. A similar design philosophy seems to carry over into the vehicle side of the faction, which revolves around another production structure called the scrap heap. During the battle report, we only briefly see it being constructed before the first Deffkoptas rollout, but the tooltip actually reveals that it's much more than a simple vehicle factory. Again, like the other Ork buildings, it's armed with a big shooter for self-defense, whilst also serving as another research center. From this particular building, we can see that the Mech Boy, Deffkoptas, Gunwagon, and eventually the mighty Gorkanaut can be made, and so it seems like the scrap heap is one of the most important structures that the faction has access to. The first unit we actually see emerging from it is the Deffkopta. Now during the match, Elliot actually uses them to pressure Space Marine positions, and it's easy to imagine them becoming one of the Orks' best tools for attacking vulnerable generators, chasing retreating vehicles, or even contesting objectives that ground forces just would struggle to reach quickly. I have to say as well that the Orks do look like they have a pretty cool supporting unit for the vehicle roster, and that's in the form of the Mech Boy. He's clearly a utility infantry capable of repairing damaged vehicles whilst also contributing some ranged damage of his own. The tooltip does note that he's effective against vehicles, suggesting that his battlefield role isn't purely just for repairing, but it probably does revolve around that the most. Pretty cool supporting unit if you ask me, and I imagine pretty important to keep around your army to repair damaged vehicles. Speaking of which, as the game does progress, the Orks begin unlocking heavier armor, and one of the first major vehicles we get a proper look at is the Gunwagon. It's classified as a heavy vehicle, it's effective at range, performs particularly well against enemy vehicles, and possesses high durability. More importantly though, the scrap heap research tree reveals several upgrades specifically designed to improve the Orcs' mechanized army. The first of these is Ard Case, which increases the maximum health of Gunwagons by 30%. Now that is a substantial boost for an already durable vehicle, and reinforces the idea that Orc armor becomes increasingly difficult to remove as the game goes on. But then there's also Grot Oilers, which improves the health regeneration of Orc vehicles whilst they are out of combat. It's certainly going to encourage players to pull damaged vehicles back briefly before sending them straight into the next fight, allowing an experienced Orc player to keep their armor rolling forward instead of constantly replacing expensive units. It is a bit of a different approach though, of course, to the basic infantry units, which look a lot more disposable. Finally though, we have loads of scrap, an economy focused upgrade that reduces the production cost of almost every Orc structure except the Gorkanaut. On paper, it might not sound particularly exciting, but when you remember that Orcs can construct buildings almost anywhere on the map, suddenly it actually becomes a very powerful expansion tool. Cheaper production structures means more forward bases, more defensive positions, and an even larger network of Orc territory spreading across the battlefield. Of course though, there is one vehicle that I feel deserves special attention, and that is the Deff Dread. It receives far more screen time during the battle report than almost any other Orc machine, and for good reason. It looks absolutely beastly. It's classified as a walker that's effective in melee while performing well against virtually every other target type. And I guess that pretty much makes it one of the faction's most versatile units. But what really caught my attention was its wargear system. Rather than simply improving the existing statistics, the available upgrades change the way that the Deff Dread functions. For example, equipping custom Mega Blasters dramatically increases its range damage against infantry, vehicles and structures, transforming it into a far more dangerous fire support platform. Alternatively though, fitting it with rocket launchers clearly shifts the focus towards anti-vehicle combat, sacrificing some anti-infantry effectiveness in exchange for stronger armor-piercing attacks and area damage. Essentially, going against infantry, you want the custom Mega Blasters, against vehicles, you want the rocket launchers. It's a much more interesting approach than simple percentage increases, because it allows the same unit to fill a slightly different battlefield role depending on what your army needs. Now, by this stage of the battle report, it doesn't really look like the Orks are simply just a faction that builds lots of units. Of course, in the early game, it does feel like numbers just really do matter, but as the game progresses, they do look like a faction that can evolve through the course of the match, with every new research upgrade, production building, and vehicle reinforcing the momentum that they've already established. It feels like the early game is about claiming territory and then refusing to let it go with as many units as possible, but then the mid-game is where all those investments clearly start paying off, with the army probably transitioning with what started off as a collection of boys into an increasingly sophisticated war machine that's preparing for one enormous late-game Waaagh. It's a mechanic, of course, that's deeply rooted in Warhammer 40k and the Orks, of course, and from what we've seen so far in this battle report, King Art Games are trying to translate the Waaagh as much as possible into Dawn of War 4. So through the match, there are several moments where queuing higher tier units is actually gatekeeped with the message, "Not enough Waaagh." Now, the developers explained that the Waaagh actually functions more like a progression system that represents the growing momentum of the army. The more successful your Orks become, the larger the Waaagh grows, and once that meter reaches its maximum, the faction gains access to everything it's been building towards. One of such things has been mentioned earlier in the video, but it's certainly worth mentioning again because it's such an important mechanic. Both Slugga Boyz and Shoota Boyz become completely free to produce. That is, of course, an enormous shift in how the faction functions, because it means losing infantry stops being such a major economic setback. It looks like it's going to capture that feeling of an unstoppable green tide, where every orc that falls immediately can be replaced by another charging into the fight. Free infantry, though, is actually only part of the reward, because reaching maximum Waaagh also unlocks the faction's most devastating units and abilities, allowing the Orks to transition from relentless pressure into overwhelming force. One of the most powerful examples of that has to be the ultimate stratagem, Unleash the Waaagh. Unlike the Space Marine stratagems that we got to see, which seem to focus on precision strikes, orbital bombardments, or just reinforcing strategic positions, the Ork ultimate stratagem, Unleash the Waaagh, enhances your entire army all at once. According to the tooltip, every Ork unit, and even Ork structures, actually gain increased attack speed and increased damage for a limited time. Even more interesting is the interaction with Waaagh banners, because any units fighting near those banners receive an even greater bonus. So throughout the game, you're encouraged to spread across the map, establish forward positions, and slowly build your own territory. Those positions don't simply provide production anymore though, they become staging grounds for one massive offensive where your entire army receives a huge combat boost. Instead of launching a single powerful unit into the battle, the Orks, they simply launch an entire faction-wide assault. Now, we did also get to see the other stratagems, such as Feral Intervention, which instantly deploys a unit of Squighog Boyz directly onto the battlefield. Now, whilst that might not sound as spectacular as dropping orbital bombardments, it does at least offer an opportunity to reinforce your army with another combat unit exactly where you need it. There's also another Ork stratagem called Rok Drop, which, as you can imagine, is dropping a massive rock directly onto the battlefield, dealing heavy area damage before releasing a random selection of Ork units from inside. I absolutely love this ability because it perfectly captures the absurdity of Ork technology. Most factions would just carefully deploy some reinforcements using a transport, aircraft, or some sort of teleportation technology. The Orks, though, they simply throw a giant rock and hope that something useful climbs out afterwards. It's destructive, unpredictable, I absolutely love it. But having said that, probably the stratagem that I could see myself loving the most, well, it's got to be the Bomb Squig Stampede, where rather than calling in some conventional fire support or dropping elite reinforcements, this ability simply unleashes a whole stampede of bomb squigs into a target area. The tooltip explains that multiple uncontrollable bomb squigs are deployed, automatically charging towards nearby enemies before exploding on impact. I genuinely can't wait to see people use this stratagem, and it's going to cause absolute mayhem. Now, when it does come to truly defensive structures, the Orks do get the mech gun, which functions as a dedicated artillery emplacement. It's described as being particularly effective against infantry thanks to its area damage, while also mentioning that it can be upgraded with anti-vehicle weaponry later in the game. The flexibility means that your defensive line doesn't just have to remain static, If your opponent begins transitioning into heavy armor, well, your fortifications can indeed evolve alongside the rest of your army. But what I imagine is going to be the most fun defensive structure in the whole of Dawn of War 4, well, it's got to be the Bomb Squig Pen. Instead of producing another conventional defensive unit, it unleashes bomb squigs, small squigs packed with explosives that charge straight at the enemy before detonating. They will be particularly effective against vehicles, but I think their biggest strength is the pressure that they create. I mean, imagine trying to push forward with a group of expensive tanks while a stream of living explosives keep running towards you. Even if they don't destroy your vehicles outright, well, they will certainly force you to react. Honestly though, overall, I think their biggest strength is going to be how fun they will be to watch and cause absolute mayhem. Anyways, the final piece of the puzzle from this battle report is going to be the Orc commander, Gorkanaut. Rather than functioning as a traditional frontline duelist, Gorkanaut is described as a mobile skirmisher whilst empowering nearby friendly units. His default equipment consists of a beast chopper and big slugger, giving him what seems to be respectable performance against infantry while remaining effective against most other targets as well. But for me, it's really his abilities that reveal how he supports the rest of the faction. One of those abilities is Beastly Rage, which temporarily increases the damage dealt by nearby orc units, but also simultaneously increasing the amount of Waaagh that they generate. It's a fantastic piece of faction design because it means the commander isn't just simply making your army stronger in the moment, he's also helping accelerate your progress towards unlocking the orcs' strongest late game tools. Another ability though, Boss Pole, improves damage and experience gained for both Gorkanaut and any squad he's attached to. Not to mention also increasing his health regeneration. So rather than sending him off to fight alone, the game does actively encourage you to keep him embedded within the main orc force, which can also continue strengthening the army around him. Now don't forget though, we didn't actually get to see the other orc commander, Gorkanaut, and I can't wait to see him feature in the future. Anyways though, through the entire match, Elliot was working towards unlocking the orcs' ultimate unit, and once maximum Waaagh has been finally reached, he does queue up the Gorkanaut. It's a super heavy walker of course, effective at range, but also performs well against virtually every other target type apparently, and possesses extremely high durability. On paper, that sounds absolutely terrifying, but seeing it arrive during the battle really does drive home just how much of a game changer it could be. Now of course, in this particular battle, it doesn't go so well because the Space Marines have got a crazy army together, but you can definitely see how this unit could be really good in a different scenario. It comes equipped with an active ability called Super Fueled Boiler, allowing it to charge towards a target location while damaging and knocking down every enemy caught in its path. It definitely sounds like a cool way to break defensive formations and create openings for the rest of the Orc army to exploit. Anyway though, coming away from this battle report, my biggest takeaway is probably that King Art Games have recreated a classic Dawn of War faction in an awesome way. They've clearly built an entire gameplay identity around the idea that the bigger the Waaagh becomes, the harder it is to stop. Every mechanic from free late game boys and expanding bases to evolving vehicles and army-wide buffs reinforces that same fantasy, and I think that's exactly what long-time Dawn of War fans were hoping to see. I'm genuinely interested to see how this faction evolves once players do get their hands on them, because if the battle report is anything to go by, well, the Orcs could end up being one of the most fun factions in Dawn of War 4. That all being said, which Orc mechanic are you most looking forward to trying yourself? Is it the base crawling, the free boys at maximum Waaagh, dropping giant rocks full of random Orcs, or using the bomb squigs? To be honest, I kind of can't wait for all of it. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and just as a heads up, there will be an Ask Me Anything session with the developers of Dawn of War 4 coming up soon, and I of course will keep you up to date, so make sure you are subscribed if you want to catch more Dawn of War 4 content. Now just as a disclaimer, there were some units for the Orcs revealed in previous videos, for example the Storm Boys. If you'd like to check them out, as well as a deeper dive into the Orcs, check out the video on your end card screen right now. Either way, as always, take care and see you next time.